Hello, everyone, and welcome to Today in News Tech, the podcast where we discuss innovation in digital journalism. Today, we've got a very special guest with us. He is a professor from the University of Oregon, a journalist, analyst, and researcher covering the local media industry. We are very proud to have Damian Radcliffe. Welcome to Today in News Tech.
Hi, thanks, Matt. Thanks so much for having me, and thank you, everybody, for joining us today.
I have 4 articles that you've written that I'd really like to go through and just hear you talk a little bit more about, ask you some specific questions on. And I'm going to really try to gear everything, constantly orient towards the local community newspaper publisher. I know that you study the industry kind of across the board, large metros and everything. Whenever we can, if we can apply it to the local paper, that's our audience. And just for some really quick background, our hometown, we're trying to expand our coverage of the industry through Today in News Tech. So you're probably one of our most cited authors. If you just look at our archives, we've got all these stories and videos that we've done about your articles. So can you tell our listeners a little bit about your background and the focus of your research?
Yeah, sure. So my name's Damian Radcliffe, as you know, and I'm a journalism professor on the West Coast of the United States here in Oregon. I moved here in 2015, having previously spent 20 years working entirely in industry, working for a variety of different news and media organizations in the UK, where I'm from, as you're probably picking up from my accent, and then also in the Middle East. And so I think because of that, and I started in radio, then moved to television, and then kind of early days of digital at the start of the new millennium. And I've also worked across everything from public service media to commercial outlets, regulatory bodies, and so forth. So I think that gives me a really unique understanding of some of the complexities of the media landscape and how much it's changing. And at the heart of what I do, the things that I'm most interested in are firstly how we make media sustainable and journalism sustainable, particularly local journalism, which is something that I have written a lot about and spent much of my career as a journalist working in the local media space. And then also, because I think the two go hand in hand, understanding, well, what's happening in terms of content innovation and how might that potentially support and inform revenue and business models. So your focus on community news and community news media and supporting those publishers is absolutely at the heart of so much of what I do and what I believe in and the media that I consume. And I'm not a traditional academic. I'm kind of a fake academic, really, in that my audience is industry folks. So for all of the materials that I write, I'm not really writing for my peers necessarily in other universities. What I want to do is write material that is inspirational, informative, provides reassurance perhaps to publishers and journalists to help them navigate the huge amounts of digital disruption that we are seeing. And so, that's the audience. I'm not writing for the ivory tower. I'm writing for small, medium, and larger newsrooms, and hopefully providing kind of practical tips and advice and case studies that people can apply to their own work.
Right. Yeah. And that's what I love about what you do. I didn't realize you were an academic until I looked into you. And like I said, we covered more than 3 articles on you. So you mainly publish for, these industry organizations, nice digestible articles with concrete things that they can apply. But you do also put out these extensive reports that are more like an academic journal article, like the 50 revenue opportunities for newspapers in 2022, which I definitely hope to get to and go into that. That's just such a big article. I'm thinking we'll do that one last, obviously.
Yeah.
And then we'll just get as much of it as we can. Let's get right into this first article that I have from the Reynolds Journalism Institute on audio formats. At our hometown, we're really focused on getting into this new medium of audio and podcasting. Personally, I see the future. I'm a big podcast listener. To me, it's like, actually, I think of it as the next generation of mobile, really, because it's
better now.
Oh yeah, that's great. Yeah, thank you. The mobile, everything is mobile now, but audio takes it to the next level where you don't even need to use your hands or your eyes, and you can still consume this content. So audio is a big focus of ours just in general. And in this article, you interviewed 5 different experts on just making the most of audio. And one thing I'll just kick it off with one question for our audience. This term that it seems like you've coined it, maybe not, but platform agnostic. This idea of being platform agnostic. What do you mean by that? And how can a local newspaper kind of benefit from something like that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I definitely can't take credit for that label. I don't know where it's from, but it's not one that I can take credit for.
Gotcha.
But the idea really is around that is saying that we should be able to consume content across a variety of different platforms. It shouldn't be just bespoke to one particular area. So we shouldn't necessarily only be able to read content in a dedicated publisher's app. We should be able to read it on a website or be able to hear it and listen to it as well. And to be able to potentially play that across a variety of different platforms. So not just on iTunes or Spotify, but it could be on SoundCloud or any number of other audio apps that are out there. And so really just trying to encourage publishers to think about the ways in which they distribute that content that reaches the largest possible audience, but also I think at its heart is also a question of accessibility, which I think is super important. For me, that's one of the things that I'm really excited about in terms of audio articles and the work that you're doing in this space, in particular, because of the fact that it opens up, I think, content that might be closed off to people with a variety of considerations, from ability to consume content on screens, screen exhaustion, which we know is very real during the pandemic. I'm seeing a lot of people amongst my friends and of course my students purposefully trying to spend less time on a screen, and that therefore their audio consumption is going up as a result. So I think part of the emergence of social audio that we saw at the start of last year with this kind of rapid growth curve of Clubhouse, for example, was in part driven by the fact that people just wanted a different medium to consume. And one of the great things about audio articles, and of course audio as a medium writ large, is it can be a background medium. You can be doing other things whilst you are listening to it. And so you don't have to sit and read a newsletter or read an article on a website. You can be eating your breakfast, dashing to get your kids to school. This is my life writ large. And at the same
Congratulations, by the way.
Thank you.
The recent newborn.
And at the same time, listening to the news in audio form, it just makes it super accessible whilst you're potentially doing other things. And I think that's really important to just acknowledge that people have busy lifestyles, and we therefore need to try and serve content to them in a way that fits around people's day-to-day lives and obligations.
Exactly. Yeah, it's almost like we have to take back that time that's been taken away by the great disruption, or whatever you want to call it, just the proliferation of content on the web. It's all pulling people's attention in all different directions. So we've got to kind of wedge ourselves back in there. And the wedge is the most convenient platform. How do you like to get your news? Do you get it on YouTube? We're there. Do you listen to this podcast on Spotify? We're on Spotify. And I've always thought of it in terms of, just giving it to them how they prefer to consume it, whether that's video, text, or audio. But you actually said something that I hadn't even considered, which is the screen fatigue. They're actively trying to get away from the screen. And if they're getting away from the screen, what's their option? They could go back to the radio. There's other ways that they could get it hands-free, unless we're there and we can capture that audience back.
Yes. And one of the things that's also, I love radio and I love live radio, and that's an environment that I grew up with and spent a long time working in. But I also like on-demand audio as well. And that's everything from podcasts to specific audio articles where I might only have 3 minutes, but this thing has piqued my interest and I can quickly listen to it whilst I'm doing something else, and I don't have to be staring at my screen in the process. Yeah,
and maybe we'll have time, and I'd love to show you what we're working on with audio articles. But what ends up happening with our content, it's unlike most podcasts. Most podcasts are hours long, or at least a half hour long, I guess. Ours are more like 2 or 3 minutes each article. If it's actually read at a reasonable pace, it doesn't take long at all. So very much bite size, and then it's part of a playlist. So it's not like you have to keep searching for stuff to play. It'll just go. We have a question from one of our attendees here. What are some of the editorial concerns to make content platform agnostic? Is there anything there that you can comment on?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a really, really good question. And actually, in this article, if you scroll down, there's a
Yes.
contribution from one of my former students,
Okay.
Francisca Monahan, who talks specifically about that and links out to a guide on it. And Franny
There we go.
offers a bunch of really great advice on this. But the key thing
Mm,
is to recognize that people who are consuming platform agnostic content may not be consuming it kind of in the round in terms of other material that's kind of packaged around it. So
yes.
trying to avoid
Mm,
kind of referencing other
right.
material that risks excluding an audience because they haven't seen or heard it. I think
Right.
that's really important. And also being cognizant of the fact, and this might be less of an issue for local newsrooms, but also being cognizant of the fact that people might be accessing your content across different time zones and so forth. So trying to avoid certain kind of timestamps and things that kind of put that content
Right.
in a particular time frame that actually
Right.
doesn't chime with the audience is one of the other things
Hmm.
to think about there.
That's a good one. Yeah, I hadn't even considered that. Great question. Yeah, keep them coming. I'll try to watch the chat as we go.
And I think one of the things that Franny
Yeah.
talks about there is the way that you can
Yeah.
also atomize a lot of your content. So, for
Right.
example, you might see a 2 hour radio show produce a 10-minute kind of highlights
Right.
package.
Right.
You've got to be really careful when you're putting together that highlights that you're not referencing things that are outside of that
Right.
piece of work, because that's going to feel as if that audience is being excluded from that material. So
Right.
it's just kind of being cognizant. It's always being kind of audience first, thinking about who's consuming this, how are they consuming it,
Right.
and what do we need to do in terms of how we position this so that they feel as if this is a self-contained piece of work.
There's a lot to unpack there. And this is something that we've stumbled on ourselves. Again, with today in news tech, the goal of it is to be a publisher, just like our customers. That's the whole point. Even if we didn't have these great interactions with industry experts like yourself, even if we were just talking to ourselves, I think it would be helpful just to feel what it's like to be a local publisher. And we're using our WordPress platform for it and everything. So I can speak to this. And Chris, who's listening, our video engineer, he talks about this. So with video, let's say a local newspaper is conducting a Zoom interview with the mayor or the mayoral candidates, and he produces this interview. He's got like an hour of video. That video can go on every platform basically unchanged. There are ways you can optimize it for Instagram or TikTok, make it a mobile frame, but they can basically just take that same video and repurpose it without any editing. Is that fair?
They can, yes, but I think there's also opportunities to atomize that as well. So
That's what you mean. Yeah.
I think
Right.
it's a legitimate question to ask, like, well, who is going to watch that hour-long interview
Sure.
with the mayor? What are the kind of really key things that we need to highlight? And of course, we
Right.
would do that in a traditional 800-word article.
Right.
So what is the audio equivalent of that? Or maybe you just create
Mm-hmm.
your 800-word article, but you
Mm-hmm.
then have a spoken version of that people
Right.
can access. And then if
Right.
people want to dig deeper, they can access the full interview.
Right.
And I actually love that as an approach, because I think one of the things that we are very cognizant of as journalists is the fact that we need to rebuild trust with audiences.
Right.
And one of the key challenges for us is that as an industry, we use terms and language that often are very alien to our audiences. They don't
Right.
necessarily understand how the sausage gets made. And
Right.
we need to do more, I think, in terms of explaining our process and how editorial
Mm-hmm.
decisions are made. And one way you can kind of navigate that is to show your workings. And so a
Right.
great example of that is, here's your 800-word article with the mayor, but here's the full interview
Right.
available in video and indeed audio form. Because if you record it in Zoom, you can also just take an audio feed of that
Right.
and squirt that out on SoundCloud and other platforms, so that
Right.
people can get the wider context and wider conversation if they want to dig deeper,
Right.
or they can trust your editorial judgment that you've picked the most salient and important points, and that's what you've distilled into that 800-word piece.
I can definitely comment on this, and I actually want to try to come up with a term for it. But what you were just saying, creating the interview, or just writing an article and then reading it off in a video, however you want to do it. These are crossing mediums, from text to audio. To me, it's always been the most natural, and it just makes the most sense. It seems the most efficient to start with video, because video has I call it like 3 dimensions of media. You've got images stacked up against each other back to back. You've got audio, and then you can even reverse publish it, quote unquote, all the way back to a text article, which is just a transcript of the interview. So this idea of maximizing the mileage of an interview, I think, is an interesting one. You do need to kind of have someone like we have Chris, who's an expert on video editing. So I think, do you have any advice, I guess, for small publishers that are trying to get into this, the simplest way, or where would you start with a limited budget, limited resources?
That's a great question. I think one of the things that is easy for publishers to do, and we're pretty used to doing now, is recording interviews on Zoom or doing things like Facebook Lives, so that you're able to create content and share it with a variety of different platforms at any one time. Just being aware of the fact that you can often you can download that content and you can then put that onto other platforms. For something like audio, if you're using a platform like SoundCloud, its RSS feed often then gets picked up by other platforms. So that enables you to be on potentially 10, 20 different audio platforms.
Nice.
And then in terms of video, if you decide you wanted to cut that up, so let's say you've got this hour-long interview with the mayor, yes, you might have an audience who will watch the whole thing, but you might have a larger audience if you cut that into 10 6-minute interviews, or if you said, actually, we're not going to cover the whole thing, but here are some of the kind of key sections that we're going to highlight, and we're going to package kind of discreetly. Just looking at kind of free audio and video editing tools that you can use. People should familiarize themselves with, I should ping a link to it in the chat, but a project called the Journalist Toolbox, which is run by the Society for Professional Journalists, which has, as its name suggests, a ton of different pages with links to free tools, but they also are producing a video every month, a how-to video every month. This is a really great resource that I use with my students, and I highly recommend kind of diving into.
Wow, absolutely.
And some of this is material for desktop, some of it is material for web, for mobile, so that you can kind of edit in a variety of different ways. And I think that the biggest mistake that a lot of people will make, particularly if you are time pushed, is to try and do something like take an hour-long interview and say, well, we're going to make a 5-minute version of this and we're going to cover all of it. My suggestion is, don't do that. Find the 5 most interesting minutes in that video and just top and tail those 5 minutes, and that's what you serve your audience.
Interesting. Yeah. So, we're taking notes as we go. How will we get this interview out there? I think we'll probably do a mix. We'll put the full version out there, then highlights. Of course, YouTube now has chapters, which is kind of a neat thing. It's like one video, but it's sort of a playlist at the same time. We're experimenting with that a little bit.
And it has auto transcription, which I think is also really useful to think about captioning of videos. Thinking about just transcription tools in general. There's a variety of different paid for services that are out there, but there are also free versions that you can use. And even kind of things like voice dictation in Google Docs, which people don't necessarily think about that. If you play a file and you have that running, it will give you a rough cut that you can then go in and tidy up. And as someone who used to hate doing transcription for interviews that I had conducted, tools like that have been a godsend to me as a journalist and as a researcher. But they're also really useful in terms of, again, thinking about the accessibility of that content for audiences and the ability to multi-purpose it.
So just to boil that down a little bit, the syndication, like you said, using apps that kind of automatically send it out to multiple apps. There's some social networks that where you can do that, like on Instagram, you can just instantly share it with Facebook, things like that to take some shortcuts. And the other big thing that you said I like, and we're thinking about adopting, is just more using the social media live functions, because then there's really nothing that you have to do after it. You don't even need to upload it. It's there, you know? But if you wanted to download it and create a highlight reel, then you could. The only other thing I guess I would say on that last one, I had some questions on the podcast interaction. Is your podcast open to interaction? Can you just expand on what you mean by that? Because that to me just sounds more like just getting feedback from users, which in general is a good idea and publishers should be doing more of. Like, you know, what stories did you like? What would you like to see us cover more of? But specifically in podcasting, would you elaborate on that a little bit?
Well, I think that you've given some great examples there of things that you can do in terms of soliciting comments, soliciting suggestions for material, guests that people might want to hear from and so forth. But I also think there's an opportunity there within the content itself to reference that. So to talk about emails that you've got or interactions on social media, because once audiences register that these comments are being heard and taken on board, it creates a more virtuous circle that encourages other people to participate. So if you are soliciting feedback and you are using it, don't be shy about making that clear to audiences so that it encourages more of the same from the same and other people.
Yeah, I love that. Just connecting with people however you can. Like, for example, if someone tweeted at you a suggestion to your podcasts, then when you release the podcast where you talk about their comment, you know, you want to mention them in that post. And that's just opened my eyes, you know, the effectiveness of mentioning people on Twitter. I mean, we got your attention. We've gotten attention of, you know, a lot of the publishers that we're covering in this series, which is just amazing. And I know it's nothing new. Twitter's been around and that technology's been there, but it's been eye-opening for me. And I just think local publishers would really benefit from that little bit of extra effort of just tagging or hashtagging a local hashtag or something, because otherwise it's just going out there in the Twitterverse and it's pretty much going to get lost, you know, in the flood.
But I think it's also taking what local news has always done and just kind of making it applicable for the digital age. So, you know, I know as a kid, you know, I might have bought the local newspaper if I was in it or somebody I knew was in it, or my school or my football team or whatever. And that encouraged me to create that media habit and that news habit. You want to, how do we do the same thing in the digital space? And that is by kind of tagging and acknowledging contributions and involvement from people across our audience base.
Right. It is the modern equivalent of, the newspaper clipping. It's funny, actually, we covered recently a story of a publisher collecting photos of a huge snowstorm on social media. So they get engagement there, and then they reverse publish those photos in the print edition. So it's, again, just making use of all their platforms and cross-promoting. It's just good marketing.
Yeah.
All right. So let's jump over to the next story that I have keyed up here. This idea of just using video. I feel like we've almost touched on it a little bit, but like if you're going to sit down and record a podcast, I guess the idea is just turn on your camera. Is that essentially what you're saying with this?
Yeah. I mean, because it's in this sort of COVID era, we're increasingly not recording content in person, and we've become much more comfortable with the idea of interviewing people remotely and doing so over a web connection, even people that are in our local community. And the sound quality for that may not be as good as people being in the same room, but as audiences, I think we're pretty forgiving about this, so long as it's listenable and so long as the content is of interest. That for me is kind of the key thing. I think you know we've always seen that with YouTube, that some of the most successful viral YouTube videos of all time have not had great production values, but they've had something that's kind of caught and captured and maintained our attention. And I think you could make the same argument to some extent with audio, although it's a little less forgiving. But yes, turning on your camera is a part of that mix. But for me, one of the things that really surprised me was this data from the Reuters Institute in last year's digital news report that said that in the US, the platform that is used the most for podcasts, consuming podcasts, was YouTube.
Look at that.
And that really surprised me because I spend a lot of my time on YouTube, but it's not listening to
Right.
podcasts.
Right.
And yet, clearly, the data from the Reuters Institute shows otherwise. When I polled my students about this, I found actually, yeah, a lot of them listen
Yeah.
to podcasts and a lot of them watch podcasts, which was
Right.
really interesting. They
Right.
really like shows where you can actually see interviewees talking to one another,
Right.
even if that's just a Zoom interview like this. It doesn't have to be a 3-camera setup or
Right.
anything particularly complicated. They sometimes just like to see that interaction. But
Yep.
because it is predominantly a podcast, they can again be going off and doing other things, and then the screen catches the corner of their eye every once in a while, and
Sure.
that's how they consume it. So it's almost like having the TV on in the background,
Right.
except it's not a TV show that they are watching, they are listening to a podcast. So
Right.
that was interesting. And then, of course, the other thing to say with this is that there are then opportunities to create some fairly lo-fi visuals for YouTube, which
Right.
can also just make that look more interesting. So
Right.
it could be that you have some slides that kind of, some images that kind of go up as part of this, or you're using tools like Audiogram and
Yeah.
Headliner, where you
Right.
can literally just ingest the whole of the audio interview, and
Right.
it will then spit out the content with a kind of caption page with a WAV file that kind of moves along as the conversation is progressing. It's
Right.
kind of hypnotic to watch a little bit. I
It
always,
is.
I always think, and it's
Yeah.
much
I
more
prefer
interesting than a
that.
blank screen
Exactly.
with
Yes.
audio.
Yeah. I mean, the visual component on social media is so strong. I mean, I've never really done a side by side test, but I'm sure people have, just comparing a link, to a website to a post that's a link and an image, just the featured image from the story, is all that it could be. Video is obviously going to be better than still image. So there's a lot to consider here. The YouTube thing, in my personal experience, it's funny because I think if you're a user that's actually on the go when you're listening to podcasts, unless you have YouTube Red, you can't really do it because it's going to shut off as soon as you put it in your pocket. So this must be for people, I would think, either watching short clips from their podcast or they're on the desktop. But
Yeah,
yeah,
or they're also using YouTube on the TV as
that's
well. So
probably a huge percentage of this. You're right.
yeah, I mean,
I
the
think it's so
YouTube
easy.
statistics are really interesting. That a few years ago, we were seeing this kind of take up curve of percentage of YouTube consumption that was on mobile. And
Right,
then suddenly it started to go the other way. And
right,
that's because people will do things like, like we have a Roku TV and we have the YouTube app and we
right,
play videos from YouTube
right.
on our TV.
Exactly.
And
Right.
so we could also do the same thing with podcasts. In fact, we also do it with music, with streaming concepts and things that people have posted onto YouTube.
Right.
So it can be desktop, it can be mobile, but we should also not overlook the trend of people
Yes.
watching more YouTube content on a traditional TV, but
Right.
that TV perhaps being on in the background again whilst you're doing other things.
Yeah, all these smart TVs, they all have, Netflix app, Hulu. If you can get your content right in line with that stuff, that I think it elevates it. Now, there's a quote in here from you, actually, from this story. So let me just read this off and then we can talk about it. People are sharing podcast recommendations with their friends. So this is thinking about how to grow a podcast once you've kind of got one going. But that kind of conversation is happening off platform, and podcasters don't know where those referrals or audiences are coming from. You go on to say that if they can find a way to close the loop and reward people for spreading the word around their podcast, I think it would be a really interesting development. I thought that was also interesting, and I had a few ideas on how that might work, but do you have any comments on how they could capture that information?
For example, some publishers have premium podcasts
That's
which you
right.
can only access behind a paywall,
Right.
or that are kind of paid for content.
Right.
Well, what is to stop listeners from having a code that they can share with their friends that enables their friends to be able to access that? So think of the fact that the New York Times has introduced this ability where if you're a subscriber, you can share, I think it's up to 10 articles a month with people who are non-subscribers.
Right.
How do you do the equivalent of that for premium audio content or audio content that is behind a paywall?
Sure.
I think the biggest challenge is for podcasters, for audio producers, we often don't necessarily know where our audience is coming from because the analytics are in a very different place to, say, kind of traditional website data.
Right.
And that's a real challenge. So trying to find ways to encourage people to share great audio that they have heard, and finding ways to understand where that audience might have come from, I think is a really interesting nut to try and crack.
It occurred to me, my suggestions were entirely dependent on a subscription model. Also, I think you were probably thinking of, how do I promote a free podcast and how do I capture that information, which is a much bigger problem. But yeah, my idea was the same as yours, a coupon code of some kind. What I see at a lot of the highly competitive food prep companies like HelloFresh, Blue Apron, they all do this because there's so many of them and they're all fighting for the same people. They have these affiliate coupon codes right in the app. And then I get a benefit. I get some credit by giving this out for people that use it. So something like that, some type of a credit that would go towards my subscription for next month, so that might work.
But they also will offer free trials. They'll also offer discount periods.
Right.
They'll offer, I love your suggestion of sort of like reward points. I think it'd be really interesting to think about how can you gamify elements of this.
That's right.
One of the examples I featured in the 50 ways to make media pay report, which you mentioned, was the way that Axios has a referral program where you get points towards swag for everybody you get to convert to taking out a subscription with them or a kind of paid relationship with them. And I think that again is a really interesting model, and it doesn't have to work for paid. It could be just getting people to sign up for your newsletter or for your podcast, etc. But finding ways to gamify it, I think, would be really interesting.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, that's got to be one of the biggest industries in the world right now, just video games. There's a lot to learn there. They're obviously doing something right.
And a lot to learn, as you said, from other industries like food and beverage, for example, of like what are the transferable ideas from organizations that are really good at opening the door, getting you to trial their product and hopefully keep coming back.
Yeah, I can name several campaigns that I've been the subject of after canceling, come back to us, coupon. I mean, they do everything that you can think of. Let's pivot then to our third article, because I do want to get to that fourth one if we have the chance on the 50 revenue ideas. But this one was interesting to me. We had an in-depth commentary on this, and I was just wondering if you could expand on this at all, just the idea of innovation in a local newsroom. The thing that jumped out at me about this article is you don't want to innovate just for the sake of innovating. You want to have like a specific goal in mind and have a clear benefit of the innovation. But anything else that you would like to expand on with this article at all?
Yeah, I mean, I think for local newsrooms, there's a couple of important considerations. The first is, you're right, not innovating just for the sake of innovating. So one good example right now would be newsrooms being super excited about TikTok and saying, okay, we have to be on TikTok.
Oh yeah.
Because everybody is on
new.
this.
Right.
But there's a really important question, which is this the right fit for your audience? Is your audience there? On TikTok?
That's right.
If it's not, is this where you should be placing your bets and investing your precious time and energy?
That's right.
Or is there an argument to say, actually, this is about reaching people who are not currently our audience, but that we want to develop a relationship with, and therefore it's worth investing in because of a sort of longitudinal relationship that we want to develop and nurture. But that's very different to serving your existing consumer base.
Right.
So I think that's the first question is, whatever is kind of hot right now, there's always a temptation to jump on that bandwagon without necessarily thinking through what the strategic goal is of doing that.
Right.
And then the second consideration for local publishers, I think, is incredibly important is, these are typically very resource-strapped organizations that have enormous pressures on to produce work across a variety of different platforms very quickly with limited resources. And I would argue that if you're going to do something like say, okay, we're going to do it. We're going to do TikTok, and we're going to do it because we want to build a relationship with younger audiences in our community in the hope that we will nurture a relationship with them over time.
Right.
That's great. what are you going to stop doing that frees you up and gives you the time and the capacity to do
Yeah,
that?
that's
Because
right.
what I see time and time again is publishers, newsrooms, journalists just add more and more things onto their plate, and they are kind of drowning in the workload,
Right.
and it's just not sustainable. So, and
Right.
people are feeling pretty burnt out right now.
Oh yeah.
That's only going to continue for some time.
Right.
So I would argue that that's the really key thing is if you're going to
Right.
innovate and do something new, you have to think about what am I going to stop doing? And so a sort of
Right.
one in, one out policy would be something that
Interesting.
I would advocate.
Yes, just for your own sanity, just maintain that flow. I mean, what has happened to our publishers? I've seen it. This company is 26 years old. I joined about 13 years ago now, and I've seen what has happened. And you talk to publishers, hey, have you heard of TikTok or this new thing called Instagram back when that came out? And it's just nothing but negativity because now it's just an extra thing I have to do. They don't see anywhere that they can give up other things. Our response to this is just to use automation whenever possible, because then you're not really adding something to your plate. What we have, and just a little bit of a plug here for our customers listening, we have an automated posting on social media. So it will just take whatever link you put on the website and just automatically share it with Facebook, Twitter. It'll even go on Reddit. Then there's Instagram and LinkedIn. Now that's just whenever you're automating, you're giving up something. So you're not going to be able to necessarily do all the hashtags or the at mentions because those aren't just part of the article unless you work them into the article. But if you can automate the process and just add another social media network to your list in your queue, that's just going to automatically get blasted. That's one thing. But then there's also the consideration of sending the same thing on Facebook as on TikTok. Those should get very different types of content, right? You need the vertical video for TikTok. The point is well taken. And I think a lot of our publishers could definitely appreciate what you said there about one in, one out.
Yeah, and I think when it comes to something like social,
Yeah.
again, the temptation is thinking you need to be everywhere, but your audience isn't necessarily everywhere.
Right.
So
Right.
you may well say, well, actually, you know what? Twitter is just not right for me and for my community because no one's
Right.
there. The conversation
Right.
is happening on Facebook and in Facebook
Right.
groups, and
Right.
therefore that's where we're going to invest our time.
Right.
And we're going to post content on Nextdoor or on kind of like other
Right.
community apps where we can kind of find people in different places. Reddit, essentially you mentioned that, is one
Sure.
potential arena which has bigger reach in the US than Twitter, which
Right.
most journalists don't realize because we spend most of our life on Twitter.
Right.
And it's worth remembering that our media habits are not those of our audience.
Right.
So understanding where
Very
your
true.
audience is
Right.
is really, really key.
Yep.
And you don't have to do everything. You don't have to be everywhere. You have to be strategic about where you place your
Right.
energies. And so when it comes to innovating, I do think it's absolutely key that this is not about adding more stuff to your plate. It has to be about either improving your processes through things like automation or
Right.
rationalizing some of the content and processes that you have to free up the bandwidth to be
Right.
able to do new things.
Right.
Particularly as when it comes to doing that new stuff, in most cases, and I've done research on this, published a report on this in October, most people in local newsrooms learn about new tech, new content tools themselves. They're self-taught. They
Yeah.
can't afford to go to conferences.
Right.
They're not necessarily bringing in trainers at great expense to teach them how to do things. They'll be
Right.
using tools like videos on the Journalist's Toolbox and elsewhere and just
Right.
kind of getting hands-on to understand how things work. You
Right.
have to have the time and the energy and the capacity to be able to do that.
Right.
No one is going to start to do that at 10 o'clock at night when they've pulled a 14-hour shift in the newsroom.
That's
So
it. Exactly.
you've got to free up your mental and physical energy as well as
Right.
your time to be
Right.
able to iterate and do new things.
Yes. And also not underestimate the time required. Oh, it takes 5 minutes to post on Facebook. Well, you got to do that for every article on your website every week. I guess it's got to be sustainable in that way too.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that came out in that series. This was a
Right.
three-part series I wrote about innovation, was that so many great ideas
Yeah.
just run out of steam really quickly
Yeah. Right.
because there isn't the energy or the kind of long-term commitment to it. And I
Right.
think one of the ways to get around that is to not only have a clear idea about what you want the benefit to be. But it is to go back to that question of, okay, if I take on this extra thing, I'm going to stop doing this other thing.
Just to kind of put a bow on this one, real practically speaking, like if you're deciding what social networks to focus on, one thing that just occurred to me is our customers could look at, or any publisher, just look at your stats and see where most of the traffic is coming from. And it's probably Facebook, right? I mean, for most local news publishers, at least that's our experience. And I know you study large organizations too, but in terms of not video or not podcasting, just text, what do you think is the biggest social network and the most bang for your buck?
It's hard to generalize, but
Yeah,
Facebook has fallen out of fashion, but we shouldn't forget how huge it is in terms
that's
of its
right.
reach, and
That's the
particularly
thing.
with older
It's got a long way
audiences.
to fall. Right.
Long way to fall, and older audiences, which tend to be the largest single demographic for local news, are still very heavy
Right.
Facebook users.
Right.
Um, but for text, we should also be thinking about, well, what are the opportunities to do newsletters using
Right.
Review, which is built into Twitter now, MailChimp, Substack. There's a whole
Right.
bunch of different tools that you can use. What are the opportunities for text messaging, or
Right.
kind of other mobile kind of friendly applications?
Right.
I mean, it's not an app that is big in the US, WhatsApp, but
Right.
I think the principles of this are really interesting. So the Oxford Mail in the UK for a long time has done a early morning WhatsApp blast of, here's our 3 top stories today with links
Right.
to them.
Right.
And they just send them out to people who are signed up to get this information blast.
Right.
Could you do the same thing with group texts and kind of other tools, just as a way to drive traffic? I think we should be looking at kind of doing more with those forms of text, and perhaps getting less wedded to the idea of having a super hot YouTube channel, for example, because I
Right.
think there are lo-fi solutions that really work for audiences as well as for publishers and journalists.
The other thing that we talk a lot about is you can use these networks, but then you're not really in control of the relationship. Comparing Facebook with a newsletter, you actually have those emails and there's a direct relationship and you control when it goes out. With Facebook, it's the algorithm. You could be putting stuff out that people that are following you never see.
Yeah.
So obviously there's scale that makes up for that. But I think a lot of our publishers are just promoting everywhere they can and just trying to get people to the medium that they prefer. If that's a newsletter to hear from us, if that's Twitter, however they prefer it. It just kind of goes back to that point again.
Yeah, with newsletters, it's also worth remembering that there are monetization opportunities there.
Right.
You can have, if you, let's say you wanted to have a weekly business roundup,
Right.
a community bank can sponsor that. You can
Right.
sell ads that go within it. You can do the same for any number of different verticals, as well as something that just kind of brings it all together. What does an education newsletter look like that just brings together the best of your education coverage, which could
Right.
just be a monthly email blast?
Right.
For me as a parent of young kids that have just started school, that
Right.
kind of thing would potentially be really useful. I don't necessarily
Sure.
have the time to
Right.
go and find those stories as they break. So
Right.
a curated experience that says, hey, you might have missed this. Here's the 4 things we published last month that you
Right.
need to know.
Right.
Could be a really valuable resource, and
Right.
one where you've already done the heavy lifting, you've already published the work. All
Exactly.
you're doing now is finding a different mechanism to curate and promote it.
It's all like a gradient of what to do. And like you said, just giving things up. So, I mean, for our publishers, the way we look at it, it's like automate as much as you can first, and then spin off other, specialty newsletters from there that you maybe manually curate, but just getting a list of the articles that have been published on the website in the last week out to people. Now we got a question from Terry here, and I think we're going to then have to wrap this up. How do we know when to give up on a trial of a new innovation and readjust to a different strategy? What should be a minimum time commitment in terms of time, energy, resources to implement a new idea?
Yeah, that's a great question, Terry.
That is a tough one. Yeah.
It's a great question, and it is a tough one. I mean, I think the key thing is you do have to give something a reasonable runway.
Right.
And for me, that's probably 3 months as a minimum. It might be longer.
Right.
because
Right.
a lot of innovations will not take off overnight.
Right.
It will be through word of mouth. And there's this kind of old cliche that repetition builds reputation, but
Right.
it's true. So if you're starting a new newsletter product, you might not get a large audience with it for a while, but
Right.
as it starts to become a regular feature, and then it's more likely to have interaction, get shared, get passed on, and
Right.
and so forth. So if you pull the plug too quickly,
Yep.
you've arguably not given it a chance to succeed.
Right.
Um, the other thing is, that doesn't mean that, of course, that you just leave it exactly as it is. You're going to tweak it based on your own kind of intuition, based on your
Right.
analytics, based on
Yep.
feedback that you're going to get from your audience, based on just seeing what other news organizations and publishers are doing and thinking, oh, that's a great idea. We're going
Right.
to take that, we're going to steal that, we're going to remix that. Here's how we could tweak that.
Yep.
It's not going to be static, but I do think you need to give something a reasonable runway.
Right.
And I also think it's worth, before investing and launching something, thinking about, well, what is the process by which we can user test this? What is the way in
Yes.
which we can actually get a sense of if there is an appetite for this? What feedback?
Right.
If we're doing a
Feedback.
newsletter,
Yeah.
who are 10 people we can trust from
Yes.
some of our most trusted readers who will give us
Right.
honest feedback about
Right.
what they like or don't like about this.
Right.
I'll give you an example of just giving something time. It's a slightly old example, but there's a great hyperlocal website in Birmingham, second largest city in the UK, not Birmingham, Alabama.
Right.
And in the area there called
Original.
Digbeth, there was a website called Digbeth is Good, and the publisher there, Nikki Getgood, used to hold a editorial meeting in a pub. And she just said,
Love
I'm going to
it.
go to be in such and such a pub, 7 o'clock on a Thursday night.
That's
Come
so
and
cool.
tell me about what you think about our coverage, what
Right.
we're missing, and ideas you have for future stories. And
Nice.
initially, no one came, but she
Yeah.
just kept on going.
She
And
showed
then
up.
she
Yep.
showed up, and that consistency and of kind of constantly saying, like, I'm doing this, of not giving up
Right.
early on, meant that over time people realized, oh, this was not a flash in the pan. She was genuinely committed to this process. And then it started to become a really successful forum for
Yeah.
a two-way dialogue and conversation in person,
Right.
with your audience. I think for me, that's a really good example of how it would have been very easy 2 weeks in to just say, screw it, this is just not going to work.
No one's
But
coming.
actually,
Yeah.
there's a skepticism from an audience
Right.
that are used to seeing kind of new products, new ideas announced with fanfare, and then they
Sure.
quickly disappear.
Right. Right.
Show you're in it for the long haul, and I think people will respond to that commitment.
That is so cool. I loved how you say that. I think it's just a general thing about newspapers too. They're these institutions. They're not just a fly by night. They have a physical location in the community. I mean, there's a huge investment there. That's just kind of reminded me of the general theme of newspapers. We're pretty much out of time, Damian. I mean, I really appreciate you sitting down with us here today. I didn't have time to go over your really interesting report on 50 ways to make media pay. Could we just get maybe your top couple things here? Because it seems like subscriptions are the big thing that you're leading with in this discussion.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we know that advertising has taken a tumble for during COVID times, but that there's a long-term decline in terms of the amount of revenue we're getting from advertising, and a natural shift towards subscriptions as a way to try and make up for some of that shortfall. So the whole first section outlines a variety of different subscription strategies and tactics. Each one of those 50 ideas has a bunch of case studies, most of them actually from the US, some from Europe and other parts of the world. But each idea is grounded in very specific realities, which I hope really helps, that these are not just kind of like abstract ideas that I've kind of thought up out of thin air. They're grounded in what people are actually doing and seeing success with.
Exactly.
So, everything from kind of like discounts to bundling to, a variety of other types of initiatives they're all kind of listed in that report. And the report actually also links out to a wider piece with 231 different revenue ideas that I put together in August 2020. And not all of those ideas will work for you, but some will. And so my deliberate intention is kind of to provide a wide variety of ideas, a sort of smorgasbord of possibilities, and then you can kind of cherry pick the things that might work for you and your communities.
Exactly. What we're going to be doing is going through this in detail and highlighting our favorites, sharing this with our customers. This is our little plug for this report. Definitely going to be looking at that more extensive one from a few years ago. So that's pretty much all that we've got time for today. Damian, again, great to meet you, man. It's so, I really appreciate you being open to this and joining us. If you're interested, we'd love to have you back some point in the future. Maybe we could even talk about some of these points in this digest. It's been wonderful talking to you. I appreciate you taking the time to share your expertise.
Thanks so much for reaching out and for the opportunity to chat, and for the great questions we've had from the audience. I hope people found it useful.
Thanks for watching Today in News Tech, the podcast covering innovation in digital journalism. You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and subscribe on YouTube or any of your favorite podcast apps. We'll see you tomorrow.
At our hometown, we help newspapers build WordPress websites, design native apps, and develop digital subscription models. If you are interested in a free prototype of your publication on WordPress, go to ourhometown.com and click the Contact Us button.